Hi, welcome to the Gospel of Peace. My name is Roger, and thank you for joining me for another week. Today we're going to talk about some various signs that Revelation is about the end times. A lot of people have conjecture about Revelation being more specifically about the time in which John lives, kind of warnings for what the church is going through or will experience roughly in that same century. Nero's ruling Rome right now, and his successor, Domitian, is even worse than he was. So there's a lot of badness going on right now in Rome. So it's easy how they could get that understanding. But there are a few things that John actually specifically tells us about what's happening in Revelation that gives us clues that it's actually about the end of the world. All right. Now we went over all the some of the mysteries of the Son of Man in my previous Revelations video, and his return and the end of the world. All that is really the central core of Revelation. The fall of the angels is mentioned in Revelation. The struggles of the church is mentioned in Revelation. And there's a lot of symbolism and the fall of man even, and its restoration throughout the years, with the final restoration being Christ's crucifixion on the cross, and then his seat being taken right there on the throne of God. Revelation also brings us to the final redemptive act where everything is made new again, which is really cool. So we're going to actually look at a couple of these proofs that John is bringing the reader to the world's end. The first proof comes right there in Revelation 6, and it's in verses 12 and 17. Now, as we're looking at this verse, this is right after 5 of the seals have been broken. So we're already seeing the plagues and the destruction and the earthquakes and just the tremendous things that are going on in the world already. But this one really hits home. The 6th seal is broken, and upon the earth is released this massive earthquake. Now, Jewish literature and tradition always mentions earthquakes as kind of a devastating effect, a massive destructive end to maybe a civilization or a city. All right. But the way they mention this earthquake makes it's not just a city or a particular people that's being wiped out in this earthquake. As you remember in the Exodus story, there are a couple times where the people that God was punishing because of something they had done along the journey, God just opens up the earth and swallows them, wiping them out completely. So God is not beyond using earthquakes for punishment, or in this case, to demonstrate that he is done. And the Jews have picked up on that, and they use that in a lot of their symbolism when it comes to ending of cities and ending of cultures. And in this case, John is using it as an end of the world. The earthquake is described as being able to move mountains and move islands. This is the first time that earthquakes in Jewish culture has been mentioned to be able to move islands completely. It's almost like the earthquakes that would have brought about the separation of Pangaea and brought about the continents that we have today, just completely shattering the earth and changing things. The earthquake reshapes the landscape, and it is a terrifying image that John is presenting of how this land will be rent in two and things will just be moved and we won't be able to recognize the landscapes, and mountains will be taken down and landmarks that we know will be just gone. But there's something else that's woven in here. We see a repeated warning in Joel 2:31 and in Acts 20 that coincides with this earthquake that makes this the final earthquake that mankind will see. The sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood. And this will happen before the great and awesome day of the Lord. Now, this sign has been spoken about throughout history as being the sign of the end times. In fact, but Christ even says, watch for the sun and the moon to change. But with this sign being in conjunction with the earthquake, that tells us that this is the sign for the world's end. That this is it. It's done. The world's not going to be the same after this. Now, there are other signs that precede. For instance, in chapter 9, verses 13 through 21, we also see that during the war in heaven, God casts out a bunch of angels. He seals some of them up and binds them to those end days. Verses 13 through 21 in chapter 9 of Revelation talk specifically about the loosing of these 4 wicked angels that were bound in the river Euphrates. Now, the important thing to know about the river Euphrates is that it is a natural border to the kingdoms of the west, a common enemy for Israel and other nations surrounding Israel there. Now, the interesting thing is, every so often, the Euphrates River water levels dip so low that these warring nations on the west can actually invade Israel and cause war. Now, in this particular passage, when these 4 angels are loosed, they actually dry up the river Euphrates completely. This symbol alone means that there will be complete access from the kings of the west against God's people. Now, we can look at modern times and kind of make some inferences here, to the kingdoms of the west and kind of what's going on today's day, with the wars and the terrorism and just the various things that are coming across. But I want you to form your own opinion about those things. I don't want to give you my opinion on those in particular. I just want to show you these scriptures to kind of give you a little bit of base for your opinion. All right. So these 4 angels are loose. The river Euphrates is dry. And we see these kings of the west rise up at the order of these 4 angels, and a massive army is formed. Now, these 4 angels are not good angels. They are the evil angels that stood with Lucifer against God. And they take this massive army and kill a third of mankind. Now, I want you to think about that for a minute. A third of mankind. Well, that we naturally assume that's a large number, but let's put this in perspective, okay? There are more than 6 billion people on the planet, and that's with a B. If a third of them were killed, that's 2 billion people wiped out by war. Now, you couple that with the previous sign that we were talking about, the other thing that came from the end, the earthquake. How many people will die during that? A global earthquake. So we're really talking about a major devastating event between the earthquake and this army. Then Revelation jumps to another sign in chapter 15. And this one leaves a little room for interpretation, because John sees 7 angels with 7 last plagues, and he actually calls them last plagues. And these are supposed to be the final judgment of God. Now, you can read through there and get what those last plagues actually are. But there's one specific passage in here that points that John has brought us to the end of the world, and not just the end of the time in which he lives. He says, with these last plagues, they are considered God's final wrath being poured out. I want to make this clear, first of all. Seals, trumpets, bowls, all these things that are mentioned in Revelation are not necessarily in chronological order. Okay, so I don't want you to flip through and go, okay, first there's going to be these seals, and then there's going to be the trumpets, and then there's going to be these bowls, and then there's these plagues. It's not like that. Okay? But it is possible that all these things happen at once. 7 massive plagues, not unlike those plagues in Egypt, magnified across the planet. Earthquake that shatters the earth, and war that wipes out a third of mankind. It is going to be a time like we have never, ever, ever seen before. And thankfully, because of the end, we won't see it again. Now, with the outpouring of the 6th bowl in chapter 16, we see the way is opened up for the kings of the east or the west to pass over the Euphrates. Sorry, east. East. I'm getting my east and west mixed up. So what I said earlier, change that to east. But anyway, the kings of the east pass over the Euphrates. They tell us that it's not a time for us to sleep at this point. We have to pay attention. Reading Revelation, it's very easy to go, oh, here's another plague, here's another. We can't do that. Now's the time to pay attention. Earthquakes, war, plagues. Again, kings are invading. Okay? This is very much a time of testing for Christians and Jews. Let's not forget, the Jews are God's people, God's first chosen. Okay? They have a part in this too. Those that remain, and those Christians that remain, God forbid there be too many of us, but if you read and study Revelation, there is clear, there will be a remnant of Christianity there to see it and experience it. And I pray for those brothers and sisters who have to live through it. It's going to be a horrible time. And God give them the strength to endure. But those that endure will reap the crown. And I pray that they are successful in that. Oftentimes, with some of the things that I did in my youth and some of the foolishness and the way I talk sometimes, and I don't always come across as the nicest person, I get this feeling sometimes that I might even be one of those that sees this. I pray I'm wrong. But if I'm not, I pray I get the courage to go through what these people are going to go through and be able to bring others to Christ. Now, with that being said, so we got God's judgment being poured out. We see in Revelation 19, 1 through 5, John is noting that there is a celebration now. So this is, you don't celebrate at the beginning. You don't really, you have minor celebrations in the middle. When you truly celebrate is at the end, when everything is done and accomplished and finished and all of God's wrath has been poured out. He is celebrating. Well, he's not. You see, a lot of people glance over this little part, and I really want to shine a spotlight on this. See, God just unleashed judgment on the earth. God's judgment has killed billions of people. God's judgment has completely reshaped the earth. He's about to have to destroy this old earth completely and bring the new earth and the new heaven and the new Jerusalem down for those that live to live on. In the celebration, we see the elders celebrating. We see angels celebrating. We see the 4 beasts around the throne celebrating and worshiping God. One thing that John does not mention at all is Christ or the image of God, either one of those, celebrating in this scene. I want you folks to understand God does not rejoice out of this. He does not get pleasure from this. While those around him are celebrating the victory over sin, the restoration of God's commands and God's order and God's purpose in our lives. And those are things to celebrate. God's mourning those who didn't, who couldn't make it, who wouldn't repent, who wouldn't see the way. One thing I've always sort of done is kind of a philosophy that I've faced with death, is that I don't mourn so much. Now, I know that seems hard, but here's what I mourn. I mourn the person that I'm unsure was saved because they're lost. Those people I'm saddened for. Those people are the ones I mourn. Family that I've lost that have, pardon me, family that I've lost that have died, that I knew had a solid foundation in Christ, I knew were saved, that I knew believed in the Lord and followed him. I celebrate. I remember them. Now, don't get me wrong, I weep at the news of their passing, but that's temporary. I celebrate that they're finally home. Their trial is complete. I'm happy for them. I can't wait to see them again. Now, the celebration is described in detail in chapter 19, and it's amazing. But what I want to do now is I want to take us to the last piece of evidence that we have that John is taking us to the end of the world. And this is in Revelation 20, 11 through 15. All the plagues have been brought out. The earth is shattered. Now it's the judgment of the dead. Revelation calls this the second death. Here's some interesting things to note in this passage. When the dead are judged by their works, God brings them out, releases them from Hades, brings them up from the sea, out of the earth that's left. He raises all the dead, and he places at his hands a book of deeds and a book of life. And everybody is judged by their deeds. And he scans their names from the book of life. Now, Revelation is clear. He judges their deeds. But then it pauses and makes an interesting thing known. Before he looks into the book of life, he grabs Hades and death. He calls them both personas. Death is the persona that chases us and causes us to live no more. Hades is the realm in which he lives. He casts Hades, that place which is separate from God, into the lake of fire first. And then death follows. Hades and death is cast into the lake of fire and is no more. And then he goes, whoever's names are not found in the book of life, they will go in after them. Now, I find it interesting that he banishes Hades and death first, because again, we're at the time of the second death. So, I don't know what John's trying to get across. Remember, there are some aspects of Revelation that are sealed. but I'm hopeful. And knowing the God that I serve, I pray that this is true. Those that were judged on their deeds get another chance. See, Revelation describes a time when the New Jerusalem is set out, and the imagery of New Jerusalem is just amazing. But there's always been this part of it that really, really has stuck with me and makes me curious. It says that there will be trade with the nations, but only those who are worthy, who are without sin, without spot, without blemish, can dwell in the city or even enter its gates. You couple that with this passage here, where Hades and death are thrown into the fire first, and then names that aren't found in the book of life are after them. It leads me to think that God is going to allow those people to get a second chance, to try again, to learn from their mistakes. That's the God we serve. Doesn't he offer each of us a second chance right now? Christ said it best. I would that all were saved. And I think this is him trying to make that happen. I really do hope that's the case. If you have any questions or thoughts about that, please feel free to share them. Thank you again for joining me for another episode here. If you're watching me on YouTube, please hit the subscribe icon there, and then the little bell right beside it will let you know when I post a new video. Thank you all. God bless.